shouldn't we be spending more time discussing how we can better protect children than worry about who's running the BBC?
Yes, I think we should, especially with the news tonight. It appears that this may be the tip of the iceberg, and there are going to be, I would estimate, thousands of people coming forward. And this is not something new, clearly. It goes back decades. It is interwoven, though, with the BBC debate. And the BBC debate is one, in my view, that needs to be about a culture at the BBC that allowed this to happen, and a culture and processes and structures that allowed the Newsnight programme to go out. And that should be the focus of the debate with the BBC, is how to rectify that. There's a phrase which is used in retail, which is called value crystallises in the storm. What that means is nothing has value unless it improves the customer's experience in the shop. And I think that should be the ruthless application of that to the BBC. That anything that doesn't contribute to the integrity and the quality of the programme on the management side of things should be done away with. That is the test that should be applied. Value crystallises in the programming, and there isn't a problem, in my view, with the quality of the programming, the journalism in the BBC. You travel around the world, not only is it admired still everywhere, it's actually a tool for democracy, and it is one thing that is way ahead of any other country, and it should not be cut back, it should not be sliced up. It should be strengthened, it should maintain its ambition, but it needs to be split, in my view, between the editor-in-chief, the creative side of things, if you like, and the chief exec, the director general. And that should address the culture which allowed that abuse to take place. I think the only positive thing that's coming out of this, as far as the abuse cases are concerned, there are clearly thousands of people out there, and listening to the moving interviews that they give, I heard them on the radio, where after decades they've actually felt that they can talk about this, and the relief that that gives them and how that makes them feel is perhaps the only positive aspect that has come out of this.
David, were you asking whether the media as a whole is too obsessed about the BBC and has lost sight of the fact that it's child abuse that was at the start of all this? Is that what your question implies?
Well, I think as a country, I mean, interestingly, your answer was all about the BBC. I mean, we're doing an independent review on the BBC. It's not the culture of the BBC that's the problem. It's the culture in this country at how we protect our children and how they're not being protected. And we should be having a review looking into how we deal with child protection, which we're failing children.
Harriet Harman.
I think it is very important that we think again and think very carefully about how we protect children and learn lessons. I think that what we're going to get is, as Murray says, this is the tip of the iceberg. There's going to be hundreds of people who've lived with the awful fear and the guilt and the suffering and all the tortured feelings of what's happened if you've been sexually abused as a vulnerable child. And there's going to be inquiries into why the Department of Health put Jimmy Savile in a position of trust in Broadmoor, what happened about why the police didn't investigate why the CPS didn't prosecute, what happened at Leeds General Infirmary, as well as the BBC. And I think that as well as just having fragmented investigations around the country, we do need to have an overall inquiry, really understanding the lessons of what went wrong. And I hope nobody will think, oh, that happened then, it couldn't happen now. And all we've got to do is think about the awful things that happened to those victims then and try and make things better for them. We've got to do that, but we've not got to be complacent and think that that sort of thing doesn't happen now. And I think there's been actual weakening of the child protection system recently, or potentially. So, for example, there's the rules in relation to vetting and barring, you know, whereby you have to check people's criminal records before they're allowed to work with children, have been slightly relaxed. We've got a situation where many social workers who've got responsibility for children have now got bigger casework, caseloads, and can do less investigation. We've just got a new law, which is that if somebody makes an allegation against a teacher of child abuse, that has to be kept secret. It can't be made public until there's actually a charge. So I think that we've been moving a bit in the wrong direction. We do have to listen to children. We do have to take it seriously. As far as the BBC is concerned, I agree with Murray. I think the BBC, having got it very disastrously wrong on this, showing a tribute programme to Jimmy Savile when they had in the building evidence of his abuse, that was terribly wrong. Then implicating somebody in child abuse who it turns out wasn't guilty of it. I mean, that was terribly wrong. But actually, the BBC is still loved, is still trusted. A period of stability and sorting it out needs to happen. But I think the BBC will go forward on this.
Let's just come back to the point about child abuse. And Chris Grayling, would you answer the point that under your government, in the ways that Harriet described, there's been a tendency to pull back from the control of people, and particularly Michael Gove and the decision to keep private or until people are charged the information about
I would completely refute that. Let's take the very practical example of a teacher. What we have had in our schools on many, many occasions is a pupil making an allegation against a teacher of violence which may be completely untrue. And that teacher is immediately thrust into the public eye and their career is ruined on the spot. Even though they may have done nothing, may be charged with nothing, we think we need to provide protection for those teachers. Not that those incidents shouldn't be investigated, not that we shouldn't get to the truth if the truth is there, but it is unfair to expose people to allegations if they're guilty of nothing and if those allegations are going to ruin their career. That is the change we've made. Now look, in terms of the broader question, I'm absolutely with you. One of the reasons, it would be very easy this week, having had the BBC in the position it is over the appalling allegations made about Lord McAlpine, it would be very easy to say that we'll pull back, we don't need to do any of the things we committed to do a week ago in terms of new inquiries. I'm responsible for one of those, the judge-led inquiry into what took place in North Wales, to make sure that the previous public inquiry, the previous judge-led inquiry, covered all the issues, looked at all the aspects of the complaints about child abuse. I happen to think that inquiry should continue, because whoever was involved in it, we have evidence from a victim that suggests that the full picture was not brought forward at the time. I think we need to get to the truth, not just so we have closure for those people involved, but also so lessons are learned. One of the lessons of the last few months, with the horrible instance we've seen in Bradford of young girls being groomed by gangs of men, it proves it can and still does happen today. So we need to make sure that we learn lessons of the past to make sure it doesn't continue in the future.
You see, what Chris has just said, can I just...
Yeah, very briefly, Harriet, so I want to... Yes.
Whenever an allegation is made, it's very difficult for the person against whom an allegation is made, if it's a false allegation. But what Chris is doing is picking out children and saying that because they're likely to be making a false allegation against their teacher of sexual abuse, therefore you should have special arrangements to protect the teacher. The point is, where does the balance of risk lie?
This is not sex abuse. This might be just a clip round the ear in the classroom.
No, it does apply
to
sex abuse.
What happens
it does apply
is if there's an allegation of violence against a teacher in the classroom, whether or not it's true, that teacher finds themselves in the public eye, sometimes in the newspapers. We don't want to see the careers of decent teachers destroyed on allegations unless those allegations are proved to be true.
This applies to sexual abuse as well.
Does it apply to sexual abuse as well?
It applies to all violence in the classroom. I think that it is not unreasonable to give our teachers protection unless they're proven to be guilty of something.
All right. The point, I think, has been taken. The woman at the very back there, then I'll come to you over there. Yes.
Sorry, just to clarify, you think it's OK for teachers to clout their students around the ear then?
No, I didn't say that. What I said...
You just said that.
No, I didn't. What I said is if there is an allegation against a teacher that a teacher has been violent to a pupil, if it's not certain that that allegation is true, it should not be the case that the teacher's name is made public, the accusations are made publicly, because whether or not it turns out to be true, in that situation the teacher's career has been ruined. Of course, if somebody's guilty of an assault, they should be punished. But if they're not guilty, they shouldn't face their career being ruined.
You've just said if it was just a clout around the ear, suggesting that that's
I didn't say that at all.
You just said it. Did you just
what
say
I said
that?
was that we weren't simply talking about incidents of child abuse and allegations of child abuse. It could be an allegation of any kind of violence carried out by a teacher in the classroom.
Well, I'm glad that you don't think we should have violence in the classroom.
All right. The woman over there on the left, on the far left, on the gangway, yes.
I think there's a massive flaw in the CRB system. I currently have
criminal record
6
checking, yes.
CRBs covering me to work in one town. And that's all because it's done every 2 years. So I could go out and be very violent to anybody I fancy, because you can't catch me for another year and a half. How's about it becomes a live system that I have a PIN card? So when I start somewhere, you take my card, you take my number, you find out actually what I have done yesterday.
OK. And the woman up there at the very back? Yes?
I do believe that we should support vulnerable young students, children and young adults. But how can we when all support services are being cut so drastically? I work in a school and I'm a family and support worker, and there's hardly any services left out there.
Tessa Mann, do you believe that the allegations that we've taken our eye off the ball on the business of sexual abuse is justified, that somehow there's more that can be done?
I think there's an awful lot more that can be done. I mean, I grew up at a time when there was no Childline, and I think probably most of the children in most of our schools would know about Childline, and they'd understand, and a lot of them called Childline to know that there's somebody on the end of the line there. One of the things I'd just like to say, I'd like to make a couple of comments about this. Firstly, in my view, all violence is unacceptable, whether that's child to child, adult to adult, child to adult, adult to child. So that's the first thing that I would say. I think the BBC, if I go back to your question, David, the BBC has to be commended on one thing particularly, and that is it has dealt with one victim, which is a member of the House of Lords, with speed, and somehow they've come to an arrangement today where he'll be paid £185,000 plus his costs. Now, I heard him speak very emotionally about the anger and the hurt that had been caused to him by what had happened to him through Facebook and Twitter and inference. I don't know how anyone can possibly forget the anger and hurt that's been caused to countless number of young people in all of this, because where that member of the House of Lords, if he's not guilty, who is? And what's happening about checking what's happening with all of that? Because that, I can't remember the name of the gentleman, Stephen something, the young man who'd made
Mesham.
Thank you, who'd made those allegations. Clearly, he'd made a mistake and there were all sorts of problems around that. But somebody did that to him, and that needs to be tracked down, and we can't forget that. The other thing I would say is, as a mother, I taught my children to show respect for their elders, good manners, and be graceful to people who are older than them and better than them. But what they needed to learn, and what I tried to teach them, is that trust is something that's earned. And that's a very different thing.
OK. Nigel Farage.
I think David's question is the right question in a sense, because we started off talking about appalling sex abuse of young children, but the BBC's become the story and it's dominated things. Look, the BBC is a terribly... You know, how we run the BBC, how it's managed, it is very, very important. But the nub of your question, look, the BBC have by no means had a monopoly on trusted institutions where child abuse has taken place. We've seen this happening in churches, we've seen it happening through voluntary organisations. I mean, it's been happening all over the place. But the question is, there are lots of bad things that happen in the world, but how do we deal with them? And my big concern is that during the Labour years, we moved into a situation where the government said we're going to do everything we can to protect people, and this includes young children. And so we move into a system where people get accused of things, and even if they're completely innocent, there's almost become a reversal of the burden of proof, and they now have to prove their innocence. Now, we've seen what's happened to Lord McAlpine. You know, he's had these horrible allegations made against him. He's quashed them quickly. He will get recompense, and nobody will ever think long-term the worse of him. But how many other people out there lose their jobs? How many other people out there are forbidden from ever working from children again on the basis that accusations get made but are not actually backed up by firm evidence? We must be very, very careful as a society that we do not do away with the principle that everybody is innocent until they're proven guilty. And that, to me, is even more important.
OK. I'll take one more point and then we must go on. You, sir.
As a consultant paediatrician, I spend a lot of my time, unfortunately, having to deal with the assessments You've mentioned sexual abuse. The other categories are emotional abuse, physical abuse, and neglect. Neglect is the biggest thing that causes the problem for the children here. The reason we're getting neglect and increased levels of abuse is that the children in this country are getting poorer. We need to start thinking about supporting the families and the children, and the governments have to change the policies to allow that to stop happening.
Okay.